Actress vanished in 1986. A Locket's film reel hid her fate curtain call. At dusk she stepped off stage into the London fog-laden, vanished before the applause faded. 7 years later, her Locket whispered the truth the spotlight had buried. The rain in London that evening was soft, not heavy, just enough to gloss the cobblestones outside the West End's smaller theatres. It was April of 1986, and Fiona Grant stood behind the thick velvet curtains of the Black Swan Theatre, her script still clutched in one hand. The rehearsal had run late again, third night in a row. She didn't mind. This was her dream, wasn't it? The stage lights had cooled by the time she exited the back of the building, alone. Her last line of the night, a monologue about truth hidden behind masks, still lingered in her throat. It was poetic in a way that no one noticed her walking into the mist. Not then, not yet. Fiona Grant was 26, bright-eyed, full of hunger. Born in Kent but drawn to the city lights. She'd landed a supporting role in an upcoming psychological thriller called Last Frame. The play wasn't massive, but it had promise, just like Fiona. She had that face casting agents liked, expressive, slightly vulnerable, and timeless. A young Audrey Hepburn without the armor. Her family, especially her brother, Daniel, hadn't fully understood her obsession with the stage. They called it a phase at first, then a nice hobby. But to Fiona, it was life itself. She believed in stories. She believed in becoming someone else so truthfully that it healed something in the audience. She didn't know someone had been watching her. Every rehearsal from the dark seats. Someone who wasn't clapping. Someone who didn't want the performance to end. The morning after she vanished, no alarms were raised. Not yet. Fiona had a tendency to disappear for a day or two to clear her head, usually to Brighton or her aunt's place in Essex. But by day 3, when she hadn't called in for rehearsal and her phone line remained dead, concern turned to fear. Daniel got the call from the theatre manager on a Wednesday morning. He had just finished grading a stack of high school essays in his flat across town. "We haven't seen her," the voice said, "since Monday evening." Daniel's stomach sank. He remembered, with icy clarity, their last conversation. A fight. Harsh words he'd told her acting was foolish. That she needed a real job. She'd hung up, tears in her voice. That was the last time he heard her speak. The search began quietly, then grew louder. Flyers went up across London. Fiona's headshot, smiling, hopeful, was taped to telephone poles and coffee shop windows. A few tabloids ran stories. Starlet vanishes in the fog. Rehearsal to nowhere. The police. Investigation started with the usual: friends, co-workers, a few ex-boyfriends. They checked travel records, credit cards, train stations. They knocked on her old college dorm. Nothing. The West End community offered sympathy, but not much else. There were whispers among the cast that Fiona had been stressed, distracted, even paranoid in the final week before she disappeared. One stagehand recalled her saying something odd. "He knows I'm alone after dark." But when pressed, no one could say who he was. And eventually, the silence grew louder than the questions. By autumn of 1986, Fiona Grant became another name on a cold case file. Daniel, meanwhile, blamed himself. He withdrew, left his teaching post, and moved back in with their parents in Kent. He couldn't walk past a theatre without nausea gripping his chest. The sight of stage curtains made him feel like he was falling. His sister, once so alive with potential, had become a photograph on a mantel. A ghost behind glass. 7 years passed, and then came the Locket. It was 1993. Daniel had returned to London, trying to rebuild. He volunteered at a small community theatre part-time, helping young performers find their voices, something he now understood meant more than applause. One day, while organizing old props in a dusty archive below the Black Swan Theatre, his fingers grazed a small, cold object tucked behind a stack of costume boxes. A heart-shaped locket, gold, faded. He knew it instantly. It was Fiona's. He'd given it to her for her 21st birthday. He opened it with trembling fingers, expecting a photo, but inside, not a picture, a tiny reel of film, no bigger than a coin. Tightly wound, old, fragile, not labeled. Just sitting there like it had been waiting. Daniel's heart pounded. It couldn't be random. It hadn't been in the original prop inventory. And this wasn't a regular prop, it was personal. Fiona's locket had vanished with her. Shaken, he brought it home, borrowed an old Super 8 projector from a retired film professor he knew, and loaded the reel, hands shaking the entire time. The footage played silently, at first just shadows, then flickering frames of a basement, stone walls, damp, a rusted cot, a chain, a woman, tied, crying, looking at the camera. Daniel gasped. He knew that face. Even after 7 years, he knew her. It was Fiona alive, and someone had filmed her captivity like it was part of a movie. The screen went dark. Daniel sat frozen. His lungs forgot how to breathe. It wasn't over. She hadn't vanished. She'd been hidden, trapped somewhere beneath the city's lights and applause, and someone had kept her there, filming her, directing her. He knew one thing with terrifying certainty. The director of Last Frame had always been strange. Echoes in the celluloid where Daniel starts digging into Fiona's last project and realizes the truth was on set the entire time. The night Daniel watched that reel, something inside him cracked. Not broke, cracked, like a dam under pressure. For 7 years he had mourned his sister's death without a grave, swallowed by guilt that hardened into silence. But now, sitting alone with the projectors, were still echoing in his ears. He knew the truth. Fiona was alive, or had been when that reel was made. The next morning, Daniel stood outside the Black Swan Theatre before dawn, staring at the brick building with new eyes. The locket hadn't been a coincidence. Someone had left it, and not just anywhere here. Buried among the props of the play, she vanished during whoever placed it there wanted him to find it. The theatre hadn't changed much. Posters from the late 80s and early 90s still decorated the side walls. The air inside still smelled of old curtains and damp wood. Familiar, almost comfortable, until you knew what had been hidden below. Daniel descended into the archive room again, flashlight in hand, his heart hammering. Every dusty box now looked like it could contain a secret. He searched for hours. Costumes, scripts, lighting gels. Nothing, until he spotted something tucked behind a shelf, a torn envelope with a brittle film canister inside, labeled simply, "Test cuts, director's copy." Daniel didn't wait. He brought it home, loaded it into the Super 8, and sat frozen as the images flickered to life. This footage was different. Still Fiona, still in the same basement. But this time, she was speaking, though the reel was silent. Acting or real distress. Her eyes darted off camera. She mouthed something, over and over again. Daniel scribbled down what he could guess from her lips. "Please, let me go. You said it was just for the film. I did what you wanted." Then a moment that made Daniel stop breathing. Fiona held up a white piece of paper. On it, scrawled in thick marker, "Help me. I'm in the basement. Studio B. Studio B. It jolted something in Daniel's memory. Back in 1986, Last Frame had done a series of test shoots at an old disused soundstage in North Acton, an abandoned BBC facility colloquially called Studio B. Fiona had mentioned it once in a letter. That place had closed in 1985. Officially, it was condemned, but someone had the keys. Someone had access, and someone had used it not to shoot a film, but to stage a prison. Daniel brought the footage to the police. They watched, they listened, they even nodded solemnly. But then came the familiar line. The footage is undated. No definitive evidence of location could be part of the film itself. Daniel's voice shook with rage. You think she faked a kidnapping scene? You think this is performance? The detective sighed. Mr. Grant, I'm not dismissing your concern, but we've seen worse from hoaxes and independent horror shoots. We can't pursue without confirmation that your sister was actually in danger. Daniel left their office feeling like he was suffocating. The world hadn't changed. People still wanted easy answers, neat conclusions. No one wanted to believe a woman could be stolen and locked away for 7 years while the city carried on. But Daniel believed, and he wasn't alone for long. Later that week, he returned to the theater, not as a volunteer, but as a man on a mission. He asked around, trying to piece together who had worked on Last Frame's pre-production. Many had moved on. Some were unreachable, but one man still lingered like smoke in an old theater. Quentin Vellner, the film's director, a former darling of British art house cinema. Talented, eccentric, a perfectionist with strange habits. Known for blurring the line between character and reality, Daniel remembered the name. Fiona had mentioned him once in a letter. Quentin's intense. He says I'm the muse the camera's been waiting for. He's always filming, even off set. It's odd. Quentin had faded from the public eye after Last Frame was quietly cancelled. No official reason. No media fallout, just gone. Like Fiona, Daniel's research led him to a shock. Vellner still lived in London, quietly, a recluse, somewhere in Camden. His last interview had been in 1987, rambling about realism beyond the script. No one had seen him in public for years, so Daniel made a choice. He went to Camden. He didn't ring the bell. He watched. He waited. Days passed then. One afternoon, he saw him thin, gaunt, pale. Quentin Vellner stepped out to collect mail. Same sharp features, now weathered. Still wearing a director's scarf, as if the world hadn't moved on from the 80s South. Daniel followed him at a distance. Noticed patterns. Vellner went to the same cafe every Friday, always sat at the back, carried an old camera bag, guarded it with his life. On the third Friday, Daniel followed him to an old flat above a pawn shop. He watched Quentin unlock the door, and hesitated before stepping in, as if checking for eyes behind him. Whatever was behind that door wasn't just dusty. Memories, it was secrets, and Daniel was going to open them all. The door behind the curtain, where Daniel uncovers a chilling truth in Vellner's archive, and a map that may lead to Studio B's secret basement. Daniel stood across the street, watching Quentin Vellner disappear into the aging flat above the pawn shop. The building itself looked like a forgotten prop, peeling paint, iron bars on the windows, a cracked nameplate that had long since lost its letters. It smelt like damp bricks and faded secrets. For days, Daniel had tracked the once celebrated director's routines. But now, standing here, it all felt real. This was it. The man who knew what happened to Fiona was just a hallway away. But Daniel wasn't reckless. He didn't want confrontation, not yet. He needed evidence, something indisputable, something the police couldn't dismiss as artistic interpretation, because if Fiona was still alive, she deserved more than suspicion. And shrugged shoulders. He waited for the night. At 2:17 a.m. The alley behind the pawn shop was dead silent. Daniel had seen Quentin turn out the lights at exactly midnight for 3 days straight. Predictable, even in madness. With gloves on, Daniel crept to the rear stairwell. The fire escape groaned beneath his weight, but no lights flickered on. No shadows moved behind the curtains. He reached the door, unlocked. A strange mercy. Inside, the air was stale. The kind of stale that clung to loneliness and obsession. Old film reels were stacked like sacred relics. Books on Hitchcock, Antonioni, and psychological manipulation lined the shelves. A single poster of Fiona, his Fiona, was pinned to the wall with red string around her face. Beneath it, handwritten notes, authentic fear, required real emotion emerges after isolation. This is her masterpiece. Daniel's stomach twisted. This wasn't love. It wasn't even madness in the romantic sense. It was methodical, controlled, cold, and then he saw the door. Narrow hallway led to a locked, closet-like room. The lock wasn't industrial, just an old deadbolt. Daniel used a flathead screwdriver from his pocket. It clicked open with surprising ease. Inside was darkness, but in that darkness, a box, labeled in white ink, Studio B, Final Sessions. Daniel lifted the box with trembling hands and placed it near the only lamp. Inside were dozens of reels, labeled by date, 1986, 1987, 1989, 1992, each one marked with a single word, Fiona. He played the first reel right there. Using a dusty projector Quentin had tucked beneath a pile of old tapes. The footage began with a slamming door, a dim room, Fiona sitting on a small cot in a corner, thin, pale, her makeup smudged. No scripts, no crew, just her, looking into the lens and whispering something Daniel had waited 7 years to hear. If anyone sees this, please tell my brother I forgive him. Daniel couldn't breathe. She was alive at least then. The date on the reel said October 1989, 3 years after her disappearance. He loaded another reel, this one from 1992. The scene had changed. A fake set resembling a living room. Fiona was dressed in 1950s housewife garb, reading lines in a trembling voice. "Can I go now?" she asked off camera. A male voice responded, "Not until we get it right. You keep blinking. It ruins the frame." She nodded and cried, but didn't blink. Daniel recoiled. This wasn't filmmaking. It was performance under duress. He took the reels, as many as he could carry, and he ran. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He watched reel after reel. Some were cuts of Fiona reciting lines. Others were her alone, speaking to the camera like it was her only friend. A silent diary, a record of captivity. She spoke about a studio in West London. Studio B, a derelict. Soundstage no longer on the city's registry. But Daniel found it. Using property archives and Fiona's vague descriptions, he traced the location to an old warehouse site just off Acton Lane, marked for demolition in 1994. Quentin had kept it under a fake production company name, and he had the only key. Daniel returned to the police this time, with reels, this time with proof. He sat across from the same detective, but this time didn't wait to be dismissed. He played the tapes. He showed the labels, the timestamps, the dates. He read Fiona's own words from the footage, and when it was done, he said only, "Now do you believe me?" Silence followed. Then the detective spoke. "We need to get to that studio." That weekend, armed with a warrant and forensics team, police broke into the condemned site. What they found chilled even the most hardened officers. A basement had been soundproofed. Black walls, a faux stage setup, lighting rigs, prop beds, even a kitchen, all behind locked, reinforced doors. The walls were lined with mirrors, cameras, microphones. There was no exit for whoever had been locked inside. No windows, no light, just recordings and notes. Dozens of pages of notes from Quentin, instructions, critiques, edits, one-line read. "Tomorrow we begin Act 3. They found hair samples, clothing, blood traces, and a faint signature carved into the wall. FG. 1986. Daniel stood behind the police tape, watching officers bring out box after box of evidence. He didn't know what he expected. Bones, photos, a message. But they didn't find Fiona. Not yet, not there. But what they found proved Daniel right. Fiona had been taken. She had been kept there for years. She had acted under coercion. She had pleaded through the camera, and Velna had captured it all. Quentin was arrested that night, in his flat. Officers found a live feed camera. It was no longer operational, but it had been connected to something. When asked where Fiona was, Quentin smiled and said, "She was perfect, wasn't she? Real, raw. That's what art should be. You just couldn't see it." Daniel watched from across the hallway as Quentin was led away in handcuffs. And though justice was beginning, the real question still burned in his chest. Where was Fiona now? Celluloid cage, where a former stagehand reveals chilling truths about Fiona's last known days, and a coded clue leads Daniel deeper into the director's sick masterpiece. For days after Quentin Velna's arrest, Daniel couldn't sleep, not because of relief, because of the silence. Fiona was still. Out there, the police had the evidence. The world now knew she hadn't run away. She hadn't snapped or vanished on a whim. She was taken, held, filmed, and shaped into a puppet for one man's twisted cinematic obsession. But knowing that wasn't enough. Daniel needed to find her. One clue burned in his mind. Tomorrow we begin Act 3. But there was no Act 3. In the reels, no new tapes. No finale, just a gaping hole in a story that needed closure. The next lead came unexpectedly. Daniel received a call from a man named Patrick Hale, a former stagehand, quiet voice, nervous tone. Said he used to work with Quentin during the late 80s. He told me never to contact anyone if I wanted to keep my kneecaps, Patrick joked over the phone, half laughing, half serious. But he'd seen the news, the arrest, the reels, and more importantly, he recognized Fiona's eyes. He'd seen them once, in a locked room. From a crack in a false wall, they met at a cafe in Brixton. Patrick wore sunglasses, despite the grey clouds. He looked around constantly, as if the shadows had ears. "I was a gaffer," he began, "lighting technician. Hired for under-label studio work, low pay, long nights. Quentin said he was making an experimental drama about isolation, but we never saw the actress up close. Just shadows, voices. He kept her locked up between shoots. Daniel's hands clenched the table's edge. She asked me once, Patrick continued, through a vent, whispered, "Is it night or day?" That's all, just that. I didn't answer. I was scared. But I've lived with it. Daniel nodded slowly. Do you remember where? Patrick looked up. Yeah. Quentin called it the cage. Studio B. But that wasn't the only place. He moved her later. Around 91. Said she was ready for a different atmosphere. Quieter. More control. That's when I left. Couldn't take it. Patrick paused, then pulled something from his coat pocket. A key, old, rusted, with the initials CSH engraved. He dropped this once. Said it was for the closing scene. I think it might be a place. I never dared check. Daniel took the key and ran it through archives and building permits, CSH, Cambour Street. House. An abandoned countryside home Quentin Vellner had inherited from an aunt. No power, no plumbing. Off-grid, perfect for hiding someone. That night, Daniel drove to the Cambour Street property. The home stood in decay. Ivy wrapped around cracked stone walls. The wooden gate swung in the wind like a pendulum marking lost time, but it was the silence that screamed the loudest. Using the key, he entered. The interior was stripped down, no furniture, no decor, just dust, stale air, and faint signs of life. A plate in the sink, a faded boot print, a burned-out candle, and a door. In the hallway behind the staircase, hidden beneath peeling wallpaper. Daniel found it. Metal, reinforced. Like a vault, he inserted the key. It turned, click, inside. Was darkness, again. But this darkness had weight like the air itself, didn't want to be disturbed. Daniel stepped down into a basement. Then he saw it, a set, like the others, but this one was different. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't designed for a role. It was meant to resemble reality. A makeshift living room, books, fake family photos, a television with no cord, and a calendar stuck on May 1986. Daniel whispered her name, Fiona. No answer. He checked every corner, every crevice. Nothing. Then on the wall a message, written in lipstick, smudged. He took me to the shore house. I see the sea now. Act 3. Please find me. Daniel stepped back. The shore house, using property records, he traced Quentin's known travel history. Among his mother's assets was a seaside cottage in Cromer, Norfolk, remote, secluded, not mentioned in Quentin's professional life. It wasn't on the police's list, but Fiona's message had made it clear. Act 3 was waiting. Back in London, the police were slow to approve a new search. Legalities, jurisdictions, warrants. Daniel didn't wait. This time, he was going himself. Before dawn the next morning, Daniel arrived at the Cromer Shore house. The air smelled of brine and salt. The cliffs towered over an endless stretch of grey water. The cottage sat at the edge like a secret holding its breath. He approached quietly. No car, no lights, but someone was inside. He felt it. Daniel circled the back. A window half open. He climbed through inside. The house was modest. 2 rooms, a fireplace, a bed, and a journal. Left open on the table. The handwriting was unmistakable. I've lost count of the days. He brings food, says I'm free, but I can't leave. My mind isn't mine anymore. But I write this in case someone comes. I think, I heard Daniel's voice on the wind once. Maybe I imagined it. Tears welled in his eyes. She'd been here recently, a sound from behind the door. Daniel turned, a creak, a shuffle. He stepped forward, and that's when he heard her voice. Weak, barely a breath. Daniel, he opened the door, and there she was. Curtain call where Fiona's return shakes the world, but the truth she carries is even darker than Daniel imagined. And justice is far from over. Fiona stood in the doorway, pale as mist. Her hair, once radiant on West End posters, now hung in unbrushed waves down her back. Her eyes, once fierce with ambition, looked dulled, cautious as if light itself felt unfamiliar. Daniel didn't move. He didn't want to scare her, didn't want to crush whatever fragile thread had brought her to that door. For a moment, they simply stared to souls connected by blood but separated by years of silence and cruelty. "It's really you," he whispered. Fiona nodded slowly. Then, with a sudden sob, she fell into his arms, and for the first time in 7 years, Fiona Grant was no longer lost. But rescue wasn't resolution. The cottage, it turned out, had been her final stage, the place Quentin called Act 3. He had let her live there in isolation for nearly 2 years, unguarded but watched. He'd installed cameras, microphones, mirrors with eyes behind them. She'd been free to walk the beach, but not to call for help. There was a perimeter, she explained to the authorities later. If I went beyond it, the sirens would start. He'd show up. He always showed up. The cottage had been her invisible prison, no bars, just fear. Fiona was taken to a London hospital for evaluation. Doctors said she was dehydrated, malnourished but stable. Her mind, though that was harder to treat. For Fiona, time had collapsed into a blur of monologues, scripts, lights, and commands. Quentin had kept her performing for his private collection, an endless archive of unreleased films where she played every role imaginable. Daughter, lover, widow, ghost, and none of them herself. Meanwhile, the press exploded. Missing actress. Found alive after 7 years. Fiona Grant rescued from Director's Island of Madness. Theatre's darkest secret unveiled. Every outlet from London to New York clamoured for details. But Fiona stayed silent. She didn't want to be a headline. She wanted peace, and she wanted justice. Quentin Vellner was already in custody, but new charges, mounted by the hour: kidnapping, false imprisonment, coercive control, sexual exploitation. The footage found in his possession made even hardened detectives turn away. But, as the trial began, something unexpected happened. Quentin refused to speak. No confession, no emotion, until Daniel entered the courtroom, and then he smiled. "Do you know what I created?" Quentin muttered as they passed. Daniel didn't respond. "I made her unforgettable. You'll see, they'll all see. Art demands sacrifice." Daniel leaned close. "You made her survive, and now she'll be the one remembered, not you." Fiona gave her statement behind closed doors. She detailed the first days of captivity, how Quentin manipulated her with false kindness, how he convinced her that no one was looking, that her career had failed, that her brother had moved on. The lies had nearly broken her, but what saved her was the voice of memory, her mother humming, Daniel teasing her about stage makeup, the way the audience once clapped so loudly after her final bow, and the dream always the same, that someone would find her locket. The trial took months. Every reel of film was submitted as evidence. Experts analyzed hours of Fiona's forced performances. One reel, however, remained sealed from public viewing. The judge said it was too cruel, too personal, too dehumanizing. It was simply labeled the final scene. Quentin had never released it, never edited it, because it wasn't a performance. It was Fiona breaking the fourth wall, looking straight into the lens and saying, "If you see this, I'm still alive. I haven't forgotten who I am, and I hope you haven't either." The jury took only 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. Life imprisonment, no parole, but Fiona's story didn't end in a courtroom. She disappeared again, this time, willingly. A private retreat in northern Scotland. No cameras, no mirrors, no scripts. Daniel visited once a month. They talked about childhood, their mother, the cat they used to feed in the alley behind their flat. One day, Daniel brought her a gift, a notebook, blank, no lines, no rules. He said, "Write whatever you want. No one will read it unless you say so." Fiona took the notebook in trembling hands, and for the first time in years, she smiled. Justice was done. But healing that would take its own kind of courage. The curtains had closed on Fiona's darkest act, and somewhere in the quiet, the first page of a new life waited to be written. The director's cut, he called it his masterpiece, a film no one would ever see. But behind every frame, Fiona's suffering was recorded, and directed by madness. The court files labeled it simply as Project Persephone. Inside Quentin Vellner's private film, archive hidden deep beneath the derelict studio, police uncovered 78 reels of footage, some incomplete, some edited, some never meant to be seen. Each reel bore the same actress, Fiona Grant. Each reel bore the same handwriting. She is becoming. What began as obsession evolved into something darker, more deranged. Quentin hadn't simply kidnapped Fiona. He had cast her in a film only he would direct. He wrote every script, set every light, told her what to feel, when to cry, how to scream. Her own voice became a stranger. The early reels showed her confused. A barren set. No dialogue, just lights flicking on, and a single camera rolling. She stared into the lens, whispering, "Where am I?" No response. Then a man's voice offscreen.com, cold. Begin scene 1. He dressed her in costumes from his failed stage productions, gowns too large, hats from another era. A wedding dress. Fiona would later describe it as living in a graveyard of forgotten stories. Quentin reimagined Shakespeare, Ibsen, even modern plays, but always with Fiona in the lead. Always with new endings. In his versions, the heroines never escaped. They begged, they broke, they obeyed, sometimes between scenes. Fiona sat alone on the floor, talking to the walls. Sometimes she sang. One reel showed her cutting her hair in silence. Another captured her drawing a door in chalk on a concrete wall and whispering, "Exit, stage left." But Quentin wasn't just recording. He was controlling. He altered her meals based on her performance, denied her heat in winter, blasted lights 24/7 when she resisted. He once left her in the set storm room for 18 hours straight. No food, no water, just sound effects of rain and thunder. The worst reel, the one sealed by court order, showed her. Final breakdown. Fiona stands center stage, blood on her wrists, a note clutched in her hand. She recites her own obituary, her voice steady, her eyes hollow. Fiona Grant, aged 29, last seen backstage, smiling. She loved the spotlight, until it devoured her. and then she collapses. But Quentin doesn't help. He whispers behind the camera, "Perfect, let's shoot again." Miraculously, Fiona survived that night, and the one after, and the next, somehow. She built an inner sanctuary, a place beyond the scripts, beyond the lights. She began pretending to comply. While planning her escape, she left clues in the performances. Tiny hand gestures, symbolic props, a sequence of lines that, when watched in order, spelled out, "I'm alive." Years later, Daniel would see those clues. In reel 34, she picks up a red scarf. In reel 42, she knocks 3 times before opening a door. In reel 47, she stares into the lens and says, "Sometimes the only way out is to become the story." He hadn't known what it meant, but Fiona did. She was embedding her SOS in the only medium she had left, film. Quentin, in his madness, didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care. He believed no one would ever find her. To him, she was a muse frozen in celluloid. He even told an investigator during interrogation, "Real actresses age, but I've preserved her. She's eternal now." The archive was seized. Experts debated whether to destroy the reels or preserve them as evidence. Decision was clear: burn it. And they did. On a rainy afternoon in September 1993, every frame of Quentin Vellner's so-called masterpiece went up in flames behind a secure fence. Fiona stood in the rain, watching, saying nothing, just watching. Later, Daniel asked, "Don't you want the world to see what he did?" Fiona shook her head. "I don't want the world to remember what he made. I want them to remember that I survived." She kept only one thing, a single frame of film. It showed her standing on a fake stage, bathed in light, but in her eyes resistance. A moment where she didn't play a part, didn't follow his script. She was just herself. Quentin's masterpiece had crumbled, but Fiona's strength had endured every take. She wasn't the girl who disappeared anymore. She was the woman who rewrote her ending. Behind the velvet curtain, he thought he was getting close to the truth, but someone else had been watching from the wings all along. The old lights in the Savoy's substage tunnels had long since gone out. Only 2 kinds of people still moved down there: rodents and secrets. But Daniel Grant wasn't afraid. He had already faced the darkest thing a man could, the idea that his sister had died without anyone noticing. Now, with every step, he hoped the truth was as close as the scent of mildew and rust that clung to the backstage corridors. It had been a week since the Locket's film reel revealed the studio Fiona was held in. The police had the evidence. Fiona was safe, and Quentin was in custody. But Daniel couldn't let it rest. There was still a question clawing at him. Who else knew? Because someone must have. 7 years is a long time to hold someone captive in a building full of people, in a city wired to gossip. He went back to the beginning, retracing Fiona's final days before she vanished. That meant returning to the West End rehearsal stage where it all started, the same theatre where Quentin once worked, the same one where Fiona had once shined at first. No one remembered anything unusual. She left after rehearsal like always. Quentin, sure, he was intense, but harmless. Daniel pressed harder. He watched rehearsals, studied old cast lists, examined schedules from 1986. Then he found a name: Martin, Bly-Dot stagehand, lighting technician, quiet, reclusive, still working. The same job 7 years later. Daniel waited until the final bow of that night's show, then followed the man into the maintenance hall. He didn't need to ask anything. Martin turned and spoke first. I wondered when you'd come. Martin led Daniel through the underbelly of the theatre, to a door behind the costume storage, nearly hidden behind stacked crates and moth-tin curtains. He pulled out an old key, rusted, brass, and trembling in his fingers. I never said anything. I was scared. He said she wanted to be there, but she didn't, Daniel replied softly. I know that now. Inside the room, Martin revealed what he'd kept all these years. Not film, not props, but journals, scraps of scripts, cast notes, rehearsal reports from 1986, and a folder marked Private QV. Daniel opened it slowly. Inside were production schedules for a show that never premiered. Blocked scenes, shot lists, and names.10 names.9 were crossed out. Only one remained. Fiona Grant. Martin spoke in a broken whisper. He auditioned dozens, said none of them were right. Fiona, she wasn't like the others. She glowed. He said he had found his Persephone. Daniel remembered the real titles from Quentin's archive. Project Persephone, the story of a woman taken from light into darkness and never returned. Martin then revealed something chilling. He hadn't just watched, he helped not with the kidnapping, but with the set building, the lighting rigs, sound effects, security doors. I thought it was a film set. Private, yeah, but legal. He paid in cash, gave fake names. I thought she was acting. Daniel clenched his fists. He wanted to shout, to blame, but he didn't, because Martin's eyes already held the guilt of someone who had replayed his mistake 1,000 times. So instead, Daniel asked, "Why help me now?" Martin looked toward the stage above them, because there's still one reel left. He led Daniel to the back of the theatre archives. Past playbills and costume sketches was a false panel in the wall. Behind it, an 8mm film canister, unlabeled still. Sealed, Martin whispered. I never watched it. I couldn't. Daniel's hands shook as he opened the reel. Back at home, in the quiet of Fiona's old room, Daniel threaded the reel onto his projector. The film clicked to life. It showed Fiona, alone, as always. But this time, she wasn't acting. No costume. No script, just her, looking into the camera. Eyes defiant. She speaks to whoever finds this. I'm not waiting for you to rescue me. I will survive on my own terms. But if you do find this, tell my brother I forgive him. Tell the world I'm real. Daniel froze, tears in his eyes. That was her goodbye. Just in case no one came. Just in case the lights never came back on. She wanted to be remembered as real, not just an actress. Not just a headline. Not just a victim. The next morning, Daniel met with investigators. He gave them Martin's full confession. He handed over the last reel, and then he made a call to Fiona. Her voice trembled when she heard about Martin, but her words were steady. He was part of the play, but I've taken my bow, and the curtain's closing on all of them now. That day, Fiona stood under the theatre's marquee for the first time in years. Not in costume, not in fear, just Fiona, a survivor. The stage had once been a prison. Now it would be the start of her final act, justice. Curtain call for the captor justice. Waited in the wings. But the director wasn't ready to drop the curtain just yet. The quiet before a storm doesn't come with thunder, it comes with silence. Plans whispered in rooms with blinds drawn. Maps spread across old desks. A clock ticking too loud. This was that silence. Before the fall of a monster who thought he'd scripted everything. Scotland Yard's Special Crimes Unit moved quickly. After Daniel delivered Martin, Bly's testimony, and the final reel, the raid was planned within 48 hours, not at the main theatre. That place had already been combed, sanitized, archived. But Quentin Voss, even behind bars, wasn't done playing his part. His mind had always worked in shadows and set pieces. What no one knew, not even Fiona, was at the Savoy studio. Wasn't the only set. Decades of obsession don't fit in one room, and Quentin had a second location, a studio forgotten by time, abandoned after a fire in 1983, hidden under a false lease, registered to a film company that never produced a single frame. The place was called Vita Lux Films. Light of Life, a bitter name for what had happened inside. The building was located just outside London, an industrial estate surrounded by rusted fences and silence. But a neighbour, an elderly watchman, had once seen something strange. Lights in the middle of the night, a woman's voice echoing faintly, cameras rolling, but no crew in sight. When police showed him Fiona's picture, he nodded slowly. Yes. I saw her, thought she was filming something strange. But the way she looked at the lens, it wasn't acting. The raid was scheduled for Friday night. No one knew what they'd find. No one knew how many secrets Quentin still buried under the floorboards. But Daniel knew one thing for certain. If Fiona's story started there, we have to finish it. Inside his holding cell, Quentin Voss was quiet, calm, collected. But something inside him had shifted. A detective reviewed hours of his interviews, and one thing stood out. Every time Fiona's name was mentioned, he smiled, not with pride, not with cruelty, with reverence. She was more than a muse, he said once. She was an idea, and ideas never die. He refused to speak of the second location, but his old production notes, thanks to Martin, had clues buried in the margins: alt scene, Vita Lux, sepia tone, underground tank access. Take 9, reshoot at backup location, same sound mix. The handwriting was his, the code was cracked, and now they were ready. Friday, midnight. 2, black vans, 4 detectives, tactical support unit. Daniel watching from a marked car across the street, heart pounding. The building loomed like a dead cathedral, shattered glass, blackened concrete. But something flickered inside. A light, a camera. They breached the front. Dust exploded in the air. Rats scattered, and then silence. Then a shout, found something. Down a hidden stairwell, they uncovered what had once been a set, still intact, theatrical lighting, mirrors, a vintage camera aimed at a stained red velvet chair, and on the chair, a dress, Fiona's dress from her last known performance in 1986, still perfectly arranged like a shrine. They kept moving. Another room, larger, soundproofed, walls covered in stills, printed frames from unseen reels, all of Fiona, every angle, every expression, every emotion he tried to own. A monitor flickered in the corner. Live, feed. Someone had been watching the building, still was. They traced the feed to a secure line from a private apartment near the courthouse. It was Quentin's backup plan. He may have been behind bars, but he wanted to watch the moment his secrets unraveled, in real time, as the raid unfolded. Daniel stared at the dress. His hands trembled. He remembered it, opening night. 1986. Fiona wore it during her monologue, the one where her character speaks of being trapped in someone else's world. She had looked radiant, terrified, but radiant. One officer called him over dot behind a set wall, a narrow crawl space, inside more tapes. But these weren't films, they were confessions, unsent letters, recordings, Fiona speaking to herself, hoping someone would listen someday. Daniel took one, pressed play. I stopped counting the days, but I never stopped believing the story wasn't over. He said no one was coming, but I knew my brother would find me, because love doesn't forget. Tears filled Daniel's eyes. The officers stood in silence. In that moment, it wasn't a crime scene. It was a graveyard of stolen time, but it was also a monument to survival. Back at the station, Quentin was told about the raid. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he smiled again. So, the final scene's been shot. The detective leaned in. No, the final scene is yours, and it ends in prison. The next morning, Fiona stood on the very stage she once disappeared from. The media crowded below. She looked out, not as a victim, not even as a star, but as a woman who had come back from the dark. She held the locket in her hand. Inside it, a photo of her and Daniel, from before it all, and a single word etched into the film reel now returned to her: light. He tried to write her story with fear and obsession, but in the end, it was her courage that gave it a true ending. Shadows in the spotlight, she stepped out of darkness into flashing cameras. But the true horrors were still waiting to be seen. The world hadn't seen Fiona Grant in 7 years, not in films, not on stage, not even in tabloids that once devoured every detail of her rising career. But now, in a trembling voice at a crowded press conference, she said her name. I'm Fiona Grant, and I survived. The news spread like wildfire. Front page on every UK paper by morning. Breaking headlines across the Atlantic. Missing West End actress found alive after 7 years. But beneath the euphoria was something darker. The question no one could yet answer. What exactly had Quentin Voss been doing to her all these years? The tapes found in the abandoned studio were just the beginning. Investigators uncovered reels of scripted scenes, each shot obsessively, reshot again and again. Dozens of versions, all with Fiona in the lead. But these weren't just scenes. They were psychological mazes, scripts twisted to confuse her sense of time, monologues rewritten to erase her identity, and replace it with the character Quentin created. He called it Project Persephone. In Greek mythology, Persephone was the goddess taken from the world above and trapped in the underworld. To Quentin, Fiona wasn't a person. She was his Persephone, lost, preserved, eternally performing. The recordings revealed how he'd manipulated her light's time to mimic day and night. Script prompts disguised as daily rituals. No mirrors, no calendars, no windows. Her only reference was the stage and his voice behind the lens. Fiona didn't remember everything, but she remembered feeling erased. He would tell me the world forgot me, that no one came looking, that I was meant to be here in his story. But Quentin didn't break her. She fought to remember her name, her family, the real stage. The way Daniel used to sneak flowers backstage after every show, and when he found her locket, that one thing he hadn't destroyed, it unlocked the memories Quentin tried so hard to bury. Daniel sat with her during every police debrief. Sometimes she'd flinch at light. Sometimes she'd forget what month it was. But her voice, even shaken, never stopped telling the truth. He didn't want to direct a film. He wanted to own a person. Public reaction was electric. Communities rallied. Actors came forward with odd stories about Quentin in the 80s. One woman, a former understudy, remembered him filming rehearsals without consent. Another said she once heard him say, "Real emotion can't be acted, it must be extracted." As Quentin's trial loomed, public fascination grew. Documentaries pitched. Talk shows reached out. Tabloids speculated whether Fiona would ever return to the stage. But for Fiona, the spotlight was still a wound. She stayed at a recovery center in the countryside. Minimal press. Strict privacy. But Daniel visited daily. One afternoon. As they sat on a quiet bench overlooking a lake, Fiona whispered, "I don't know who I am without the stage, but I don't want to be who I was in that basement." Daniel didn't push her. He just handed her a notebook. Inside it, blank pages. Then start writing. Be the one to tell your story, not him. Meanwhile, prosecutors built their case. They had Fiona's statements, hundreds of tapes, forensic evidence from both studio locations, Martin Bly's testimony, but they also had something new, a hidden vault. In Quentin's personal effects, recently uncovered at his countryside property, inside it, scripts, but not just Fiona's, names of other actresses, photos, casting notes. He'd planned this before Fiona. He may have done it before. The public began to shift from fascination to fury. How many lives had he touched? How many truths still buried? Scotland Yard reopened several cold cases of missing theatre performers from the early 1980s. One, in particular, stood out. Clara Hill, a supporting actress who vanished after a failed audition for one of Quentin's unproduced films. Now, her file was reopened, and the lead detective said something chilling. "We thought Fiona was the story, but maybe she was the one who survived to tell it." Quentin's lawyer claimed mental instability, that he was an artist misunderstood, that Fiona had not been kidnapped, but had voluntarily entered an immersive role. But that lie shattered under cross-examination, because Fiona had the tape, a tape Quentin forgot existed. In it, a younger Fiona is seen crying, pleading, begging to leave. He cuts the scene, then tells her, "We'll do it again. You'll get it right this time." That single clip ended any chance of his defense surviving, and when it played in court, the entire room went silent, not just because of her voice, but because of how inhuman his was. Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs, "Believe survivors," "Justice for Clara," "For Fiona," for them all. And inside, Fiona took the stand, not as a starlet, not as a ghost from a forgotten mystery, but as a woman who stood in darkness, and still found the strength to speak. "He took my years, but not my voice." The trial lasted 3 weeks. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty on all counts, sentenced to life without parole. Quentin Voss's final scene was behind bars. No audience, no camera, no control. But Fiona's story wasn't over. Daniel was approached to write a book. He declined instead. He and Fiona decided together she would write it. In her own words, her own way, the title. Through the lens my life captured and reclaimed, she was once written into someone else's story. Now she was ready to write her own. The final curtain setting, London and countryside, 1993. The stage once took everything from her. Now she returned not to perform, but to finally be heard. For months after the trial, Fiona Grant remained away from the cameras. Away from press, away from reporters, even away from most people. She didn't need fame anymore. She needed freedom. But healing wasn't just time. It was truth. It was the cold unraveling of what really happened. Not only to her, but to others. Authorities combed through Quentin Voss's possessions, hidden vaults, locked drawers, false-bottom trunks filled with unmarked tapes. One by one, they were catalogued. The list grew longer and darker. 5 other women, that's how many potential victims were identified. Actresses, understudies, or performers who crossed paths with Quentin in the early 80s. 3 were confirmed missing. 1, Clara Hill, the woman Fiona's family had never heard of, had disappeared after a callback. Her case, once cold, was now roaring to life. Fiona offered her help, quietly, without cameras, without spectacle. She sat with Clara's mother, held her hand, listened as the woman cried over photographs that had sat untouched for a decade. They called her troubled, said she just ran away, but she loved the theatre. She wouldn't run, she'd never leave. This wasn't just Fiona's story anymore. It was about every woman who had been used, manipulated, discarded in the shadows of ambition. And Quentin Voss. He became a symbol, not of genius, but of unchecked power, hidden in the dark corners of art. The theatre that once made Fiona famous now faced its own reckoning. A formal inquiry launched into past productions, casting records, and industry practices. West End's most elite were called to testify. Some admitted to looking the other way. Others claimed they never imagined it could be that bad. But the silence had lasted too long. In the middle of it all, Fiona published her memoir. Through the Lens, My Life Captured and Reclaimed It. Hit shelves with quiet power. No book tours, no press blitz, just a voice, finally uninterrupted. The first chapter began with her last memory before she disappeared. A cup of tea on the dressing table, a line she was about to rehearse, a man waiting at the door with a script that would steal her life. The final chapter, a walk in the woods behind her recovery center. No stage, no camera, just her. Fiona declined all offers to return to acting, but she didn't leave the theatre behind. Instead, she started a foundation, the Grant Trust, dedicated to mental health services, support for survivors of abuse in the arts, and reforming casting safety protocols in the UK and beyond. Daniel stood beside her at the launch event. Same boy who once taped flowers to her mirror. Same man who now made sure no one would ever forget what she'd endured and overcome. My sister was taken by a monster pretending to be a visionary. But she came back stronger than the script he wrote for her. Years later, journalists would revisit Fiona's story. Documentaries were made, some factual, some dramatized, but none of them could capture the quiet strength she carried, the way she reclaimed her name, her voice. Her ending, Fiona never needed the stage again. Her life became the story that echoed, louder than any performance, one about love, about grief, about survival, and about a brother who never gave up. The theatre where she vanished. It now bears a plaque, simple, small, but unforgettable, to Fiona Grant, who came back and gave voice to those who couldn't. The spotlight once held her captive, but in the end, it lit her path to freedom. Thanks for sticking with FlickerSoul's story until the end. If you enjoyed it, give this a like and share if you haven't already, and subscribe for more. Top of form.